This is The Persuasion Game, the Forges podcast all about the art of persuasion. Each episode, we connect with marketers, business leaders and beyond to learn how they use persuasion to influence their customers, convince their stakeholders and drive their businesses forward. Hello, Laura.
Hi, Adam. How are you doing?
I am very well, thank you. How are you?
Very excellent and very excited about today.
I am thrilled about today. We're going to be speaking to someone who has worked client side in an innovation hub for a long part of her career. Now, I have always been interested in how that works inside a client organization when you've got small brands that are being launched and created, and how they compete with the bigger businesses and the bigger brands within the organization that are also competing for the same resource. And we're going to find out a bit more about that today.
And the interesting thing about our guest today is that she has also spent a lot of time agency side, including doing a lot of very close consumer work. I think that's a really interesting position to come to innovation from. Sometimes when we think of sort of visionary innovation, we tend to think of the sort of Steve Jobs, like don't ask consumers what they want, just show them. Whereas actually, I think what we're going to find today is it's very much about joining the dots of lots of different inputs, but very much with like consumer centricity at the heart of the thinking. So it should be a really interesting chat.
Absolutely. Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Jane Buck is a visionary thinker with uniquely diverse and impressive experiences defining the future of some of the world's biggest brands. From working as a small core team founding the skincare brand Ren, now part of Unilever Prestige, to global roles in innovation and portfolio management for some of Unilever's biggest brands, including Knorr and Dove, Jane has always blazed her own trail. This, combined with her years of experience as a planner and consultant for companies including PepsiCo, Mondelez and Frito-Lay, make her a serious force to be reckoned with in the innovation world. And as of 2024, she's now taking that experience back to Mondelez as head of global innovation for another iconic brand, Cadbury. Welcome, Jane.
Great to be joining you.
So, Jane, you've had a very varied background in your career. You've worked in planning, insight, innovation, marketing, and capability. How has that background shaped how you think and approach your work?
Fully. I think I thrive on the fact that my background is quite multifaceted, but actually at the end of the day, it really comes back to a few basics, which is people's behavior. So I've always been consumer centric, and brands. I just love brands. So I think bottom line, all the different parts of my career are essentially rooted in people, observations, behaviors, and brands and how they behave, what makes them tick, what makes them grow. It's always back to the roots of working with how consumers interact with the stuff we sell.
You've said in the past that you almost think of brands like humans. What do you mean by that?
I sort of think of shaping them almost through the same rules that humans, human behavior. So I always perhaps personify brands in my mind. So I'm also quite always interested in the brand's stretch and the possibilities that they could move into.
So how do you spot these opportunities for brand stretch then?
Bottom line, I realize I'm a pattern spotter. Somehow I like to see patterns in stuff, and I probably see them everywhere. What I bring to this kind of work is just understanding the patterns that make things, that what makes things tick, but also then to use that to look into the future. Because for me anyway, if I understand the patterns, make connections, then I can start to get a bit of a feel for what's coming. And so I can look at something and then I spot that it's similar to something else, or it triggers a thought as to why is that the case? And then I'll make a connection. So, I was thinking about this. I think I'm always carrying around hypotheses in my head. I know it sounds a bit strange, but I'm always trying to prove, disprove things. And I guess basically I like to understand how things work. So it's a little bit always the backdrop in my mind when I'm trying to understand stuff.
It's interesting that you say people's motivations, because one of the things I know from working with you is that you're always pushing for that deeper why, and you're kind of, you keep pushing on it. Can you tell us a little bit about understanding people's motivations and how you get to that?
I would say I'm conscious that my whys are built on a very deep experience of seeing year on year on year patterns that somehow I'm keeping track of in my head and just keep referencing. I saw a really clear data point that showed that the way people are snacking is changing, and that snacking, for example, is becoming now data proven more prevalent than eating meals for a certain age group. But it was not black and white in a data point in such a way that you could convince the business or people around you who weren't so close to it to see that. So I found quite fortunately a data point which proved that and showed the shape of a shift in snacking behavior that just was an eye-opener, an immediately clear view of how there is a kind of paradigm shift, let's say, of snacking. So that then unlocks a whole conversation, a different framing for conversations with people. If you can find that data point, which I did, to show the shift in the landscape that's going on. And then immediately you reset the conversation with people. Immediately everyone is on the same page, and then it unlocks a completely different way of looking at the opportunity. Yeah, it's about finding the data points that prove the hypotheses have been building in my mind over time, and just shift conversations to a completely new way of looking at the framing, and in this case, snacking moments.
So what was this reframing data point?
If you're eating fewer meals and you're eating more snacks, then actually the context for snacking is different. But people don't talk about the context of snacking being different. They just talk about that particular snack. But I'm always thinking, okay, but the reference point has changed, and therefore the role of that snack is different.
I think that's a perfect example. I think the thing that's really interesting is carrying around all those hypotheses in your mind. You have to be quite patient, and you have to be quite comfortable with fluidity in a way. Like, you have to be quite comfortable with, like, well, I wonder if this is going to shape out this way, or I have a hunch that this is going to, and it might take a few years of things feeling quite fluid. Is that something that comes naturally to you, or have you had to work on it?
I think I walk around with a ton of ambiguity in my head, and we used to talk about workshops being the muddle in the middle. And I'm quite comfortable with the muddle in the middle, because I always have a sense of what's going to be the next step after that muddle in the middle, even if I don't know exactly what it looks like. But you're quite right. I think because I have a whole bunch of those things mulling around in my head, I'm comfortable to hold on to them. Sometimes frustrating that they don't land at the right moment, but nevertheless, you're right, with a bit of patience, eventually they do. And actually, even, my current role, there's a lot of new work happening, and really exciting work. And one of my line managers said to me, one needs to be really able to handle ambiguity in this role, and you seem to be able to do it. And I do. I'm really comfortable with that level of ambiguity. Obviously, at some point, eager as well to make sure it lands in something very concrete, which is also important to me. But I don't get fazed by ambiguity. Because I think somewhere there's always some processing going on that's trying to work it through, and I know it will come good in the end. So I think that ambiguity is critical to keep things in a more vision-led way, and to keep moving into the longer term picture, because longer term is complex to work through. So I have to, and everyone around, has to understand the need to land things and execute. The difficulty comes if that happens in such a way that there's no framing of it, there's no bigger picture, there's no context for it. So it just becomes very tactical, and it's very easy to fall into that trap. So I'm fine with the desire to land things and to know the so what, but only, for me anyway, in a satisfying way, if I can get clear on the backdrop for it. And then you can make a decision, even whether that's a good so what or not. Because the other thing is, you also need to know how to judge whether you've made a good decision or not. There's another bigger goal that we can chase in the longer term, which is in this direction, but is, X, Y, and Z further along the line.
I so agree. I was talking the other day about the importance of context and wider context, which I think is something you really evangelize about and, really champion. And I always think it's a bit naff, but, it's kind of analogy of Game of Thrones. It's like you can be obsessed with which of the houses is going to win, but meanwhile, the White Walkers are coming in.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It doesn't really matter
Exactly.
who's going to win in the immediate competitors, because the whole world's about to change.
But it's exactly, if you put your eyes down too close on the ground in front of you, you don't see the path ahead. And it's just that simple. You just have to see the bigger picture to know how best to put that first foot forward. Otherwise, you won't realize, let's say, if you're walking along slowly, that you're about to walk into a hole.
And on balance, then, in the organizations that you've worked in, do you see that as being the bigger challenge, the kind of bigger picture visionary thinking, or is it in that more tactical lens? Where is the bigger opportunity for the corporates that you've worked with?
Vision is quite hard and rare to really have big visions, only because the pressure is just so massive on the short term. So, I'm not naming names with any of the work I've done, the companies I worked in, but it's just genuinely a difficult thing to have a really big vision. I'm because you do need to focus on the short term, absolutely no doubt. The ideal is managing the both, and it's actually really difficult. It's that stretch from big to small all the time, and to make sure that the work streams are connected, which again is why I like frameworks, because otherwise you don't get the bridge from the long term to the short term. And I have also seen too much the other direction, where you have a sort of big vision, but it just doesn't land, because there is no connection to not just the activities that are going on today, but the way the whole business is kind of constructed, the way people are thinking, the language. It's like two separate worlds. So for me, I'd rather see a continuum from one to the other, that you create the connections. And people will talk about vectors or multi-year platforms, but I think that's the better way to look at it, is to just keep a big strategy and understand the bridges between the long term, short term.
I mean, you were at Unilever at a time when it was launching a lot of brands, really exciting brands in the beauty and personal care space, including Love Beauty and Planet, which I think now is worth over $1 billion. What was the role of, the short and the long term in your work there? Like, how did you kind of balance those two things to both, think about the long term future, but also try and let the rubber hit the road?
Yeah, Love Beauty Planet is a lovely example, and that was probably my biggest success case, let's say, of helping create some real value, as you say, over €1 billion in actually quite a short period of time. From scratch, this brand didn't exist at all. And it was something that was born out of a workshop that I was doing, where, I sort of spotted the name and the opportunity of the name of fitting the real zeitgeist of the need for skincare, mass skincare, to move into naturals in a way that it hadn't before. So that was not just going back to these threads of the past for me. It wasn't just that I spotted this, it was actually called Love Peace Planet at the time, this name, and thought that's really interesting place to start for a new brand. It's actually because my whole life I've been more, I was a vegetarian since I was 18. Laura knows I was always sustainability minded. So I was banging the naturals and sustainability agenda in Unilever for quite a long time prior, in the role I was in running the innovation incubator. And because I had that understanding of the need to help move these big legacy brands, legacy business into this sort of this space, which was the natural space, which was hard for brands that hadn't existed there to deliver. Most people it wasn't embedded in the culture of the business to be thinking, to understand the naturals business. I came in from outside, really understanding the nature of what naturals would mean to those consumers that really wanted to buy into it. And the consumers that buy into the mass brands tended not to be quite so tuned to the subtleties at the time of all the natural insurgent brands that were existing back then. So that's big picture vision, and then having the opportunity to land it in something very tangible was just took time to just keep shaping and banging on the drum for the narrative of needing to bring naturals to our consumer, because it was ideally people would have wanted to do it through their existing business rather than need to create a new brand.
Yes, that's what I wanted to ask you, because I think when I was at Unilever, we launched Persil Naturals.
Yeah.
And it was, let's take the logo and we'll make it a bit smaller and we'll have a really big leaf and it will smell really nicely of aloe vera. And then, you're sort of instantly in a frame of, oh, well, it's a very small opportunity because it's only 2% of this big brand. And I think what you're saying is that's the mistake, is kind of going like, well, let's take an existing brand and make a natural variant. Like this is quite a different approach, isn't it, in terms of going after that consumer?
Yeah, and creating. So when I was running this part of Unilever, there was a time in that business where we were able to create new brands. To your point, Adam, and it wasn't always so. So as Laura's saying, it's much more efficient to bring in, to use the power brands to take on that trend. It's really painful to create new brands and build them. And these big businesses are not built for that. They're built to scale. They're not built to nurture these, let's say, more type propositions, emerging spaces, emerging consumer groups that are leading the trend. And actually, it's a bit like the global local sort of story. It goes in waves, whether companies do it or don't do it. So there was a period of time where Unilever did create all its own brands and then launch them, and that was a huge success. But there were many, many others we did actually which didn't stick so well, because it's just difficult to have essentially founders sitting within these big corporations. And Love Beauty Planet did luckily just capture the time so well, and was really well executed by a team.
It's also, what I love about Love Beauty Planet example is it's also a conflation of two trends that often are kind of positioned, if you look at a lot of documents, on like other sides of a wheel. So, you'll see like, oh, premiumization in beauty and sustainability. And it's almost like, even in our visual way of thinking about things, it's like, it encourages a way of looking at like, well, that's one way and that's another way. And actually what you were seeing was like the convergence of those two things as an offer.
Yeah, well, I think for me, that's what innovation is actually, is mashups. I mean, it's, especially when you're creating a new brand. I mean, to just be building iteratively on existing stuff is not the big step change way forward. So obviously there's all different levels of innovation, but something like that, to create new space, new momentum, you need to basically combine slightly opposing forces. Like any good proposition, there's a tension in there, and that combination, just getting that combination right, obviously is the smart part. But it's true, I think, really for all good innovations, and start to capture a new space. And what are the barriers? Just find what the real barriers are and overcome them. What are the tensions in the category? How do you solve for them?
So it's almost like you're finding two areas of kind of delight in consumers' lives and then going, well, why can't they coexist? Like, what's the tension? When you talk about this tension, what kind of things are you imagining?
Yeah, delight, but also what are the barriers? So just taking a really obvious one, like instant foods. If you have a pot noodle kind of, or a convenient instant pot, they taste delicious, but they're not necessarily that good for you. But there are moments where you still do it anyway because it tastes so delicious. But I find it fascinating, like Huel, if I watch what's happened with Huel in the market and how they've started life as a protein powder for bodybuilding, basically, and just stretching, and then moving into that same pot space, but with a proposition that's built on actually pretty strong nutrition credentials. And now they're working very hard to say that it tastes great and is a tasty solve. Well, obviously because of where they've come from, they've got a much more credible chance to convince people that they're not bad for you than those brands that started in taste telling you that they're healthy and trying to add a bit of health credentials. But they are both, the reason they're doing it is because they are genuinely trying to solve that tension of super convenient but not healthy. I worked on bouillon cubes, and it's a category where salt is in a way that at the basis of the category to help give flavour, and obviously gives fantastic flavour with the product, but it is definitely a barrier. So only when the technology to unlock salt flavour without salt came through could zero salt be kind of created. But you have to work hard with these things because people also, it's a double-edged sword, because people know that the ingredient that's unhealthy is they don't want to eat the ingredient that's unhealthy, but they also somewhat doubt if you take it out and say you're replacing it, will it really work? So, is zero salt really going to taste as good as the alternative? And the same is true in the naturals product in skincare. If it's natural, even if you tell me how high tech it is it really going to work as well?
I remember you talking about Ren trying to go into shampoo for a while, and you were saying, the big problem is, people want suds. That's the cue that it's working. And if you don't have sulfites, it's not going to work. But then you've kind of seen these interesting things like co-washing coming in, or bar soaps, or things where you naturally don't get quite so much lather. And maybe people are a bit more comfortable with things changing.
You have to educate people slowly. Obviously, there's the kind of fanatics who don't care. And so, for example, in healthy, more natural foods, it probably doesn't taste quite as good as the over-flavored stuff. But because you want, your priority is to eat well, you get used to it, and that's you will sacrifice on taste. Little by little, I think, with some really good product development and a lot of education, people get used to it. Just as slowly our taste buds get used to less and less salt or less and less sugar if you educate it the right way. But it does take time. And actually, that's one of the things I've also seen is with innovation, you have to be quite careful not to go too far against existing behaviours. So the best thing is to really work within the guardrails of people's comfortable behaviour, so that you're not having to change behaviour and change product narratives.
Tell us a little bit about working on the beauty brand Ren when it was a startup.
The thing with Ren that for me was so important is I absolutely believed in the products. And, the amazing thing about Ren was just product absolute hero, and the quality, obsessiveness around the quality, delivering to this sort of need for clean, more natural products. So it wasn't a fabricated story. It was genuinely something that I always really passionately believed in and wanted. To have such a high quality, relatively accessible, I think category changing brands was very exciting. So yeah, I mean, it was hard, and it was certainly, as I say, all consuming in terms of the conversations. But on the other hand, it was also incredibly exciting to see it in store, to see something that I was stacking shelves pregnant with my first son when it was the very first, literally when it was a sort of almost a prototype in a Conrad hotel in the front lobbies. It was very much part of our lives, but I had to also keep working to help, as I say, fund it at the beginning, but also, in the end, Anthony and Rob were really the ones day to day in the office growing it. The birth of Ren showed me how I would bring that to my work, that sort of more entrepreneurial spirit, to see how something can be created from scratch and become real. So it gave me a belief actually in the possibility of creating something. And I honestly do think Love Beauty Planet was born out of that understanding. And in fact, when I was at Unilever, I created this new brands program, which Love Beauty Planet was one example of it. So I think the combination of understanding how small businesses operate, can play to a niche audience and can grow is something that I actually bring probably into my work every day as well. I kind of can't help but think a little bit more laterally like that. Even if I'm working on big brands, I want to bring a bit of that same spirit to the big brands that I work on.
That's a perfect segue, because what I wanted to ask you is a bit about how you can inspire that lateral thinking, kind of agility and entrepreneurial mindset in other people. I know you talked about how you're often thinking about other categories and you've got a wealth of experience to draw on. But what would you say to people that are perhaps earlier on in their journey and thinking about how to think more expansively? What should they be doing?
Really stay close to all the trends. I mean, and Laura, remember, I'm a slightly obsessive shopper. So just even recently I had to go and look for some products. And before I knew it, I just loaded my bag up because I was like a kid in a sweet shop grabbing all these interesting things that I found. So I'd say really just stay close to products. So whatever business you're working in, especially if you're in a global team or in a role which is in analytics or something, your head is always thinking. And it's actually very difficult to keep the creative part of your brain alive. So one thing I would definitely do is just always stay really conscious to keep the creative part of your brain alive, and scour the shops. Always just keep an eye out for new stuff coming through. Look at adjacencies. Always think about what the adjacencies are. Just keep alert to trends and new themes that are coming through. Obviously, keep an eye on all the social media, the relevant stuff in social media. But the other thing I do and appreciate a lot is speaking to companies that are pushing into areas that are interesting to me. So if you can create conversations with new companies that are doing interesting stuff, I'm able to, maybe in my role, but have conversations with people, and not necessarily with an outcome immediately to work with them, but to start to just get to know what's out there, get to know new people. So I'm doing that more. I'm working with startups to just get close, to stay close to a very different type of business problem, different type of people, but also just emerging things that are happening in the industry.
You're also very known, and I've gained the benefit of this, in sort of pushing people slightly beyond their comfort zone, but in a way that is sort of for their own best interests or for the best interests of an idea. And I wondered, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I realised at some point that I had a phrase that may sound a bit strange, but that I like to lead from behind with the team. As you know, Laura, I could be described as more of a vision-led type leader, and I've seen that on profiles that have been done for me. So that I definitely have a strong sense of where I want to take things, and I think I bring that to the conversations. But actually, when it comes to working with the team, particularly the sort of newer people into the team, I really try and almost hold my arms out wide and walk behind them, and give them room to try and find their own path forwards. So I'm pretty good at delegating and letting people find their way through. And what I really do believe in is actually the way in which people show up needs to be true to them, so that not to dictate or have an absolute expectation. Actually, that's something I find quite difficult in big corporate companies. And I have to say, not where I am now, but there's one way, for example, if a company is full of extrovert people, and that you have to be really good at being, a good extrovert to survive and thrive. Well, I'm actually not, and I found it quite difficult sometimes to be an introvert in these companies. So I really appreciate, if people are different, to let them succeed through their differences, rather than try and kind of mold them to be something they're not, and give them just room.
It's also a little bit about being comfortable with being uncomfortable, isn't it?
I also believe that you do need to be pushed, and I've pushed myself so much over the years, and I've been pushed, and it's painful, and it's just there's some agonizing moments, but in the end, you really can break through and suddenly realize that you can do an awful lot more than your head let you think you could do. When I say I lead from behind, I really do like to say I've got people's back, and I hope that feeling is strong.
I was thinking about what books might inspire you. Have you read Radical Candor?
I love that concept, actually.
Yeah, I can see that with you, where there's a lot of clear feedback about what needs to be done, but it's in the spirit of the work and the development of the person, and like with good intent, rather than, politicking. Like there's a high trust equation in the conversation.
You're quite right, Laura. So for me, actually, the point is always about the work. So I struggle as well if it's political, and I absolutely, not only do I hate that, I just don't thrive in it. I find it really difficult. So if I am quite pushy, perhaps at certain moments, but it's always to get great work, and it's never personal. And I think that does come through with the people I work with. If I'm pushing something, it's always to get to a better outcome. But yeah, the intention is the key thing, and I think that you can sense it with people. If it's self-serving, or if it's to look good to their sort of senior line managers, rather than genuinely to get to a good outcome, you can feel the difference.
Excellent. That's really, really interesting insights there. Thank you.
Fabulous. Jane, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Really loved your inspiration and your openness about all the different elements of your experience. Thank you so much for sharing.
Great to talk to you both.
I really enjoyed that, Laura. How did you find it?
I always love talking to Jane. She has a really different perspective on the universe in a way that I find very illuminating and enriching.
And you've worked for Jane, haven't you? I mean,
I have.
Yeah, I mean, I found the stuff.
Followed her around those shops with the extra basket we needed for snacks.
Yeah, I mean, she must have been a really interesting leader in the businesses that you've been in. How did you find her leadership style?
Very inspiring, sometimes challenging in a good way. I think a lot of the things she talked about, she really lives those values in how she actually behaves, which is, always a huge positive.
Yeah, I think the thing that I really took out of that was the importance of having a very clear vision for what you're trying to do. You know, we speak to lots of brands who, you know, some of whom are struggling quite a bit at the moment. You know, we're seeing private labels stealing market share. We're seeing, you know, shrinkflation make the news and consumers losing trust. And I think it could be fair to say that some of that is linked to sort of losing sight of the bigger vision, the bigger purpose that you're playing in consumers' lives, and focusing too much on what's going to create short-term value.
And it's challenging, isn't it? I mean, I think one of the things she was very candid about was holding hypotheses in your head is not always comfortable, and sort of living with big questions without jumping to solutions is not easy. I certainly find it very tempting to go, I've got a solution, and, you know, to actually sit with that and really play with an idea over time and be patient with it and be comfortable with not knowing is a particular mindset, but one that I've always found inspiring from Jane. And I think a lot of us could do well to remember as we sort of chase next month, next quarter, etc.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of a theme there, isn't there, around discomfort as well. When she talks about her leadership style as pushing people into the things that, you know, she feels that they could do really well at that, but they might not want to, you know, get up on a stage and speak to, you know, a room full of people. I think, you know, that really came through in this idea of like leading from the back and pushing people to the fore and challenging them to push themselves. And
challenging it in a way that's positive, them focused, the work focused, not sort of politicking, I think is always a real positive that people can take forward, and it's a huge motivator.
Yeah, a really inspiring interview with a really inspiring leader.
See you next week.
See you next week. Thanks for listening. If you'd love to hear more from marketers, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about how to use the art of persuasion to drive your business forward, then make sure you're following the podcast in your favourite podcast app. And just a last ask from us. This is a new podcast, and we'd love it if you could be persuaded to help us spread the word by telling somebody else about it, leaving us a review, or even better, sharing an episode on social media. Search The Forge on LinkedIn.